A very rich gentleman, sir. He arrived by ship last night from Sidmouth. He's going from here to Bath, and then to London, I think, sir."
"William Elliot," said Mary. "That must be our cousin, Anne. And here in the same hotel with us. He is going to be the next head of the Elliot family, when father dies, you know, Captain Wentworth." "I'm happy to know that the next head of the family is a gentleman," Anne said. But she left her words unfinished, because Captain and Mrs. Harville and Captain Benwick arrived and took them for a walk in Lyme. They walked first through the streets of the old town. Then Louisa said she wanted to walk along the Cobb again, so they all went back to the beach. The Harvilles did not come with them. Captain Harville had a bad leg, and he was tired, so they stopped at their house. Captain Benwick walked on with them to the Cobb. The wind was quite strong on the sea wall, so they all went down to the beach below it. Louisa wanted to jump down from the wall, and Captain Wentworth gave her his hand to help her. She smiled and jumped, but she did not catch his hand, and she fell. Her head hit the beach hard. She did not move. They all stood without speaking. Then Henrietta started to cry, "Louisa! Louisa!" "She is dead," said Mary, her face white. Captain Wentworth took Louisa's head in his arms. His face was as white as Louisa's. Charles and Anne took Henrietta's arms and helped her to sit down before she too fell. "Somebody help me, please," said Captain Wentworth. Help him, said Anne. "Leave me. I can easily look after Henrietta. Help Captain Wentworth with Louisa, quickly." Captain Benwick and Charles moved quickly to help Captain Wentworth. "A doctor," said Anne. "We must get a doctor." "That is right, a doctor," Captain Wentworth said. "I know where the doctor lives," said Captain Benwick, and he started to walk quickly along the Cobb to the beach and to the town. "What can we do for her, Anne?" Charles asked. Captain Wentworth turned to Anne for help too. "We must carry her to the hotel, slowly and carefully," said Anne. They started to carry Louisa slowly along the sea wall. When they were outside the Harvilles' little house, the door opened and Captain and Mrs. Harville came out quickly to help them. "You must bring her in here. The doctor can come here to see her," Captain Harville said. They put Louisa into Mrs. Harville's bed, and the doctor soon arrived. He looked carefully at the cut on Louisa's head. "No, she is not dead, but this is a very bad cut," the doctor said. "She must stay in bed for 2 or 3 weeks. She must not move from her bed." So Louisa stayed with the Harvilles at their little house in Lyme, and Charles stayed at the hotel in the town. He wanted to be near his sister and to help Mrs. Harville with her. The others went back sadly to Uppercross in the carriage. Anne had only 2 more days at Uppercross. 2 days later, Lady Russell came to take her to Sir Walter and Elizabeth's new house in Bath. It was a dark day, with rain in the sky, when Anne drove away from Uppercross with Lady Russell to Bath. They knew, from one of Elizabeth's letters to Lady Russell, that Mr. Elliot, the gentleman at the hotel in Lyme, was now in Bath. "And I hear he is a very handsome young man, Anne," said Lady Russell. "It is going to be very interesting to meet the next head of the Elliot family, I think." Anne did not say a word. Chapter 4. Bath. Sir Walter's house in Bath was in Camden Place, one of the best streets in the city. Many rich and important families lived in Camden Place, so Sir Walter and Elizabeth were happy. Anne's father and sister were happy to see her and show her their new house. They told her about their new friends in Bath, about the people they did or did not want to know in Bath, about the tea shops and other good shops in Bath. They did not ask about Uppercross or Kellynch. They were only interested in Bath. Anne listened politely. "And our cousin Mr. Elliot came to see us too, Anne," said Elizabeth happily. "He arrived in Bath some days ago and called to see us. Father did not much like him when he was a younger man, but now he is a nice, handsome young gentleman, and Father likes him very much. He is staying in Bath for the winter too."
"He came to visit us 4 or 5 times last week," said Sir Walter. "Had dinner with us last Thursday. A very polite young man."
Anne listened to all this. "Why does Mr. Elliot suddenly want to know my father and my sister?" she thought. "Why is he suddenly interested in us after all this time? Perhaps it is Elizabeth he is interested in, and not Father." All through dinner they talked about Mr. Elliot, and suddenly, after dinner, Mr. Elliot arrived to visit them. When he came into the room, he was amazed to see Anne there, but very happy to meet her again.
"Miss Anne Elliot, my cousin, and we were in the same hotel together in Lyme. I am very happy to know your name this time," he said.
He sat down with them, and they talked about Lyme and the hotel there, and Anne told him about Louisa's accident. He stayed for an hour. He liked sitting and talking to Anne. The time went very quickly. The winter weeks went by, and Anne got to know Mr. Elliot better and better. She did not understand why he was suddenly interested in them after 10 years without knowing them, but she slowly started to like him. He was always friendly and polite to her, sometimes too friendly and too polite, perhaps, she thought. Her friend, Lady Russell, liked Mr. Elliot. She thought he was interested in Anne and was perhaps in love with her. Perhaps he was the rich and important husband Lady Russell wanted to find for Anne. Anne did not think this. She told Lady Russell one day that she was not interested in marrying Mr. Elliot. Anne also met an old school friend called Mrs. Smith and started to visit her quite often. Mrs. Smith was ill and did not go out much. She had no money. Her husband was dead, and she lived very quietly in 2 small rooms not far from Camden Place. Anne always liked visiting Mrs. Smith. Lady Russell often took her to Mrs. Smith's house in her carriage, and then Anne sat and talked to her friend all morning. Mrs. Smith was a clever woman, and was always happy and friendly. She never talked about her illness to Anne. February came. One day a thick letter came from Mary in Uppercross too. It came to Bath with Admiral and Mrs. Croft. They were in Bath for some weeks, because the Admiral wanted to see a doctor there, and to visit some old friends from the Navy. Mary's letter told Anne that Louisa was better after her accident, but that she was in Lyme with the Harvilles. Louisa and the young Captain Benwick were in love, Mary said, and Captain Benwick wanted to marry her. "So Louisa is not going to marry Captain Wentworth, you see, and we all thought that Captain Benwick was in love with you when we were in Lyme, but we were wrong," Mary wrote. Anne was very happy for Captain Benwick and Louisa. She was also happy to know that the Crofts were in Bath now, and to know that Captain Wentworth was not going to marry Louisa. The Crofts came to visit them, and Anne often saw the Admiral and his wife walking in the town. She saw that they were always very happy when they were together. One day, after a visit to her friend Mrs. Smith, Anne met the Admiral in the street outside. The Admiral walked back to Camden Place with Anne, and they talked about Captain Benwick and Louisa. Suddenly, the Admiral said, "All this is quite unlucky for Frederick, you know. My wife and I thought Miss Musgrove was in love with him, but she was not. We are thinking of inviting him to come and stay with us here in Bath. Do you not think, Miss Elliot, the Admiral asked, "that we must get young Frederick to Bath?" The next time Anne went out into the town, she saw Captain Wentworth. She was in a small tea shop near the window when suddenly Captain Wentworth walked in with some of his friends. He saw her, and his face went quite red. She saw in his eyes that he was at the same time amazed and sad, but perhaps happy to see her again. He spoke to her, and then turned quickly away and spoke to one of his friends, but he was not cold, and he was not friendly to her. After a minute or two, he turned to her again. "You are going home, I see, Miss Elliot, but it is raining and you have no coat. Can I help you to find a carriage? You cannot walk home in the rain." "Thank you, Captain Wentworth, but no. I am going with Mr. Elliot, my cousin. He is walking home with me. Ah, here is Mr. Elliot now." Captain Wentworth remembered Mr. Elliot very well. The man outside the hotel in Lyme, looking at Anne in the early morning and thinking she was beautiful. Mr. Elliot came in quickly, and because of the rain, he wanted to leave the tea shop quickly before it rained harder. She only had time quickly to say "Good morning to you" to Captain Wentworth before she was out in the street walking home with her hand under Mr. Elliot's arm. But many questions about Captain Wentworth danced in her head. Was he unhappy about Louisa's marriage to Captain Benwick? Was he happy to see her in the tea shop? How long was he going to stay in Bath with his sister? Nothing happened for a day or two. Then an important friend of Sir Walter invited all the Elliots to go to the theatre one evening. They arrived early at the theatre and waited by one of the fires inside. Suddenly the door opened and Captain Wentworth came in. Anne was nearest to him. "How do you do?" she asked when he saw her. He stopped, and they talked for a minute or two about the weather in Bath and about the Crofts. Then they had nothing more to say, but he did not leave her. Suddenly he started to speak again, about Louisa's accident, and her love for Captain Benwick. "He wants me to understand that he was not in love with Louisa at Uppercross and in Lyme," she thought. "Is he trying to tell me that he loves me?" she thought. When they went into the theatre, Anne walked without seeing anything, without hearing anything. She was very, very happy. Mr. Elliot sat next to her, but it was difficult to listen to him, to talk to him, to think. Captain Wentworth was with his friends, quite near them, and she knew that he watched her with Mr. Elliot. She saw his face change when he saw them together. He did not like to see her with her cousin, the polite Mr. Elliot. For a minute she was happy that he did not like it. She knew now that he loved her after all this time, but then she thought, "I must show Frederick that I do not like this cousin, this Mr. Elliot, that he is nothing to me. But how can I tell him?" The next afternoon Anne went again to see her friend Mrs. Smith. She wanted to tell her all about the evening at the theatre. She knew her friend liked to hear everything. "I know you had a very good evening, Anne," said Mrs. Smith. "I can see in your eyes that you are happy today, that last night you were with the man you love more than all the world." Anne's face went red. How did Mrs. Smith know about Captain Wentworth? "But please tell me, Anne," Mrs. Smith went on, "does Mr. Elliot know about me? Does he know that I am in Bath?" "Mr. Elliot?" Anne asked. "Do you know Mr. Elliot?" She suddenly saw Mrs. Smith's mistake. Her friend thought that Anne was in love with Mr. Elliot. "Yes, I know William Elliot very, very well," Mrs. Smith said, quietly and sadly. "And I can see that you are in love with him, that perhaps you are going to marry him." "Marry Mr. Elliot?" Anne was amazed. "I am not going to marry Mr. Elliot. It is not Mr. Elliot that I—" She stopped. "Why did you think that?" she asked. "Because I know you are often together, and I know some of your friends here think the same thing too." She suddenly smiled again. "But I am very happy to hear that you are not in love with Mr. Elliot, and that you are not going to marry him." "Why are you happy about it?" Anne asked, and so Mrs. Smith told her about Mr. Elliot. "He is a cold, dark man," she said. She was angry now. "When I was young, before my husband died, Mr. Elliot was my husband's best friend. My husband loved him. I know that he often helped Mr. Elliot with money. Mr. Elliot always wanted money. He only wanted to be rich, so he married a girl from a rich family. But he did not love her. Her money was all he wanted. When Mr. Elliot had a lot of money, he turned away from my husband. He didn't want to know him. When my husband was ill and when he died, he left me with no money. Mr. Elliot did not want to help me or hear about me. Then last year his wife died too, and he had all her money. The next thing he wanted was to have an important name, to be Sir William Elliot, the head of the Elliot family. So he came back to Somersetshire, to Bath, and tried to get to know your father and sister again. He is only interested in William Elliot. He is never interested in other people. He is a very bad man." Anne listened to Mrs. Smith's story, and she read some letters from Mr. Elliot to her friend and to her dead husband. She saw that her friend's story was all true. Mr. Elliot was a very bad man. She went home. She was happy that Mr. Elliot was away from Bath for a day or two. There were a lot of things to think about, and she must tell Lady Russell the story about him. She must ask Lady Russell to help her. But when she arrived back at Camden Place, she had no time to think. She found that Charles and Mary were there. They were in Bath for 10 days. Elizabeth talked about giving a big dinner for them, with some of their new friends in Bath, the next day. She sat down and wrote letters inviting people to come to the dinner, and she invited Captain Wentworth to come too, because he is one of Charles's friends, she said. The next morning, Anne went to visit Mary at the hotel she and Charles were in. Other people were there too. Captain Wentworth was there, at a desk in one corner of the room, writing a letter. He finished and stood up, ready to leave. Suddenly, he pushed the letter across the desk in front of Anne's eyes, and then quickly left the room. The letter was to Miss A.E. Anne fell into a chair near the desk, opened the letter, and read, "I must speak. I cannot go on without knowing. My love for you is not dead. I cannot love anybody but you. Why do you think I am here in Bath? For you. What do I think about all day? You. You must see that I am waiting for you. After 8.5 years now, I am here waiting for you. Please do not tell me that I am too late. F.W." Anne did not move or speak. She was white. The others saw her white face. "You are ill, Anne," said Charles. "I must find a carriage and take you home to Camden Place." But Anne did not want to go in a carriage. She wanted to walk. She wanted to try to see Captain Wentworth in the street, to answer his letter with a word or a look. She wanted him to know now that she loved him too. They were in Union Street when they saw him. He turned and saw them when Charles called to him, "Captain Wentworth!" He stopped and came across the street. He did not look at Anne. "Are you going up to Camden Place, perhaps?" Charles asked. "Can you walk with Miss Elliot? She was not well at our hotel, and now I am taking her home for an hour or two before the dinner this evening. But I must be at the gun shop in the Market Square in 10 minutes. The man there wants to show me a new gun. Perhaps you can take my place and walk with Miss Elliot." Captain Wentworth smiled, said yes, and in half a minute Charles turned and left them. They started to walk slowly up the street together, Anne with her hand under Captain Wentworth's arm. They began to talk. After another minute they turned together into a little garden and sat there together to talk about the sad story of the past 8.5 years. And in all the years after that morning they never forgot what happened in that garden and the things they said. They talked about the past 4 or 5 months, of Uppercross, of Henrietta and Louisa, of their days in Lyme, and of the love they now knew they had. By the time Anne and Captain Wentworth arrived back at Camden Place, they were 2 of the happiest people in the world. Anne and Captain Wentworth were to be married in the spring. When Mr. Elliot heard this, he soon left Bath. He did not want to marry Elizabeth, and he knew that Anne knew his story from her friend Mrs. Smith. Lady Russell, too, started to like Captain Wentworth. She wanted most to see Anne happy. She saw now that Captain Wentworth loved Anne and that Anne loved him, that all Anne wanted in the world was to be the wife of this handsome young officer.